Welcome, my name's Steve Kenzie. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. Welcome to both our Climate Forum and our session, our Climate Action Q&A surgery on decarbonizing logistics. I'm going to come back to this at the end, but this is the second session in our Climate Forum, a series of 6 events spread over today and tomorrow, where we will be addressing many of the biggest challenges that companies are facing with regard to climate action. Today's session, this session is the third Climate Action Q&A surgery that we've organized, and the objective here is to provide an opportunity for people that are not experts in a particular topic relating to climate action to have an interactive session and pose questions to people that are. And we've been hearing from members that one of the biggest barriers to setting a science-based target or a net zero target is Scope 3 emissions, and particularly decarbonizing logistics. We know this is a really big problem. And so we are very fortunate today to be joined by 2 genuine experts in this topic who will be able to field your questions and move this agenda forward. So firstly, before I introduce them, how do you pose questions? We have both a chat function and a Q&A function, and we really strongly encourage you to use the Q&A box for questions and the chat box for chat. Sounds obvious, but not always so. And once you're in the Q&A section, there's a function there, there's a little thumbs up sign beneath the question. And so if someone else posts a question there that you would also really like to hear the answer to, please do indicate your interest with a thumbs up, and that will move that question up to the top of the list and increase the likelihood that we will be able to get to it. So do please take this as an opportunity to get the questions you want answered, even if you're not the one that has typed them into the box. Okay, without further ado, we're going to be joined, well, we already are, here they are on screen. Dr. Monica Araya is the transport lead for the Climate Champions team. She leads a campaign seeking to accelerate the uptake of zero emissions mobility, working alongside the high-level climate action champions for COP26. So recognized as a global leader at the higher level policy side of this and more. Our other speaker, Lorna McAtear, is the fleet manager from National Grid, and Lorna's actually an international CPC. She's qualified kind of at the coalface of this issue, running a fleet. And so she would have firsthand knowledge of many of the challenges that you are facing in terms of how to decarbonize your logistics. Before National Grid, Lorna also led the Optimize Prime project at the Royal Mail, which is a really important piece of work in this space that has been, truly groundbreaking. So we're really fortunate to have you both, and really thank you for joining us today. Rob, next slide, please. Before we get stuck in to the questions, I'm just going to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the UN Global Compact. I expect that not everyone participating today is familiar with our initiative, and that is something we are duty-bound to correct. So the Global Compact Network UK is part of the world's largest responsible business initiative, the UN Global Compact. We connect companies and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to driving sustainable growth. There are currently 12,500 companies around the world participating in the Global Compact. There are local networks like ours in 68 other countries, providing support to companies that are committed to our 10 principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. To join the Global Compact is very straightforward. We need a CEO commitment, and he or she needs to send a letter to the UN Secretary General with a heartfelt commitment to operationalize our 10 principles, to report annually on the progress your company is making towards that goal, and to support the wider UN development agenda, which at the moment is the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we invest quite a bit of our time in working towards that agenda as well. If you'd like more information about the Global Compact, you could put a note in the chat or just follow up with us after. We'd love to hear from you. And now, without any further ado, let's take those slides away and let's hear from Lorna and Monica. You're very welcome. So the first question I'd like to put to you, we'll start with you, Monica. What is the role of business in the transition to net zero transport? Very big, wide one to start.
Yeah, so, well, we could answer this in many ways because, you know, it's a deep question if you think about it. But there is a pragmatic way to answer it because transportation is such an important part of our daily life. So I do believe that business are at the core of telling society what the solutions are that they want to put forward. And their role is to set targets, but also ask society to support them in this journey, given that we as consumers are the ones who also vote with our purchases. So let me ask you from the perspective of a race to zero mentality, which is how we are framing a lot of the campaigns in the lead up to COP. And I'll mention COP because it's going to happen next year, because it's going to be a visible moment. But I don't want to give you the impression that this is a task or a vision just because of COP. It's a societal conversation we have to have, and the next 5 years are critical. So I would say, especially, you know, if I can't see the participants, but I imagine you are people from companies really trying to understand what your role is in this. I would say that one very important role for you as companies or people working inside companies is to have a very clear target. And by target, you know, obviously it means something in the short term, in the medium term, in the long term. And that target has to be about how to get to zero, because at the end of the day, we're not in a world that is about making sure that logistics are a little bit better or a little bit cleaner. We were in that world maybe 10 years ago, but now is a race to zero. And I really want to keep using the term race to zero because it's a race. We have to go fast because of a big problem we have with how we run the economy, especially transportation with fossil fuels. And so it's a race, and it's zero because it's about getting to a point where we go from using fossil fuels, liquids, and we're gonna go to a world that is going to be using mostly renewable electricity. And we can argue about we can talk about other options, but that is a big shift in how we have to tell the story. So I am a big believer in the 100% effort that you put out there for the company, so that nobody can hide behind the fact that, you know, oh, I don't feel compelled by that target. So starting with that big vision is very important. The other thing that I would like to emphasize, and I would really love to hear from Lorna. I'm very grateful, Steve, that you will that I have come across her, because I really love the idea of pairing with people who are actually doing this on a daily basis. The other point I wanted to highlight is that you're not alone, right? As Steve said, it's difficult to get certain things done. But in the scheme of things, if you think about a lot about all the problems we have to solve, all the sectors we have to decarbonize, I would actually argue that road transportation is not easy, but it's easier than aviation or shipping. So we have technologies and we have a lot of know-how. So my point is, you're not alone. There are a lot of efforts out there to create clubs of ambition, like the Transportation Decarbonization Alliance. So the point is, you don't, if you're in your company trying to figure out how to do this, just keep reminding yourself that you don't have to start from scratch. There is a lot going on in the business space. We can talk in a different loop around the role of policy, the role of cities. But my first invitation to you is to be very curious about what is going on, because there are a lot of good news. So yes, it is a problem for the world. There is a lot of pollution out there. But at the same time, I actually would like to leave you with this idea that you are in a very, if you're working on logistics, you are at the cutting edge, because I believe that is where a lot of breakthroughs will happen in the next 5 years. And I would be very interested to hear from Lorna about whether you agree with that.
Me too.
No,
So over to you, Lorna.
No, that's brilliant. And actually, it's lovely to hear you saying some of that, because that's exactly some of the points and where we need to come from. So we've got all the obvious stuff. And for me, it's knowing you're part of this bigger picture. And it doesn't matter how big the picture is, your part is important to it. And it doesn't matter how tiny the step is that you take, you're going to help on this race through to that net zero target that we're talking about. And if you take that even further, it's knowing how you fit into that picture. And I love the fact you talked about targets, because that's exactly what I did the first time I arrived at National Grid. I came in and set a net zero target of 2030. And everybody kind of went, why are you going for that one when we've got this big one of 2050? I wait, it's going to change, just watch, and we need to get there. And I need to plan for it now. And all the work starts now in order to take you on that journey. And it's about having the confidence to take that step forward. And it's being empowered to make those decisions and move that as well. So you can look at things, and I get asked on that 2030, well, how are you tackling some of your 4x4 vehicles? I don't know yet, but I'm still going to do it. So I can do this, and I can do all of these within my normal replacement cycles. The vehicles are already there. I don't have to be too onerous on it, and I can take that step forward. The rest of it, I'll start coming to these sessions, for example. I'll network with my peers. I'll talk to manufacturers. I'll beg, borrow and steal ideas from all over the place and have a go at it. And I think the key thing here is having a go. And also the role of business in this is it's private and public sector coming together, because your solutions aren't going to be in your traditional linear way of doing it. You're going to have to think differently. You're going to have to look across use cases. So your small panel vans will have a type of use case, whereas those 4x4s that I mentioned that go in off-road to places that have no grid infrastructure, because we are grid and we're putting it in, I need different types of solutions. So it's taking those steps through in a very practical way. You know, and I've mentioned being grid there, you know, our role as business as well is recognizing this new green recovery that we're going through and investing in those infrastructure solutions that help me as the end user, as a fleet operator, deliver some of those solutions as well. So I think it's very important, and the key takeaways are, we're in this together. Don't be frightened of it. Take that step forward, because we can start delivering this.
Yeah, can I add something? Because this is so great. I think you won't find a lot of disagreement in the next hour. Which is, I mean, I think that this is good, because I suspect people who are joining really want to hear about what's going on. And I really want to emphasize what Lorna said about thinking big. You know, this is key for this decade. We really have to say goodbye to incrementalism, in the sense that, yes, of course, sometimes you need to improve things here and there. But this decade is a decade that requires to get out of that and say, how do I do the best and the biggest, what is the biggest idea I can bring to the table when it comes to, for example, this question of logistics. And that would allow you to be more, you know, it's a certain hunger for, you know, the best solutions from a technology perspective, the best peers that you can find, the best policy that you can ask for from policymakers. But the concrete point I wanted to make about, as a follow-up, is that one of the roles that I see from the private sector in particular that that is happening already and is very powerful is the idea of going to car manufacturers and actually challenge the myth that there is no demand. They can't wait to get these vehicles, so it's really important to have that private sector to private sector conversation. And it's actually quite powerful when you have a fleet owner saying, of course I want to electrify, I just need more variety, I need you to produce them faster. And I think that's one of the most important things that fleet owners can do to debunk the myth that there is no demand for these vehicles.
You saw me nodding vehemently to that one. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, we're going to come back to that. I want to ask one more higher level question, and I'll start with you, Monica, on this one. And it's sort of the flip side of that other one, is to talk about the role of government in the transition to net zero when it comes to transportation. And is there our earlier session today was on business and government. And so
yeah, of course. And of course, I would like to, for the purpose of this session, it's very important to keep in mind that yes, we have to have signals from national governments, and I can give you very concrete examples. At the same time, we have to also keep in mind the role of cities, because it's just super important when it comes to logistics, and is part of the puzzle we have to solve, because there are a lot of there is a lot of collaboration that will be needed. So from the perspective of national governments, there are quite a few things they have to do. Obviously, logistics, in going to zero and in road transportation is part of a bigger puzzle, which is to become a net zero economy. Before we used to say by 2050, now we say as soon as possible. If somebody can do it by 2035, fantastic. So I don't want to say 2050 in case there are countries that want to go faster. I'm based in Amsterdam, which is a fantastic city where it comes to the vision for zero emission logistics. But I come from Costa Rica, and I was very involved in the past in that national vision to go fossil free as an economy. So it's a very powerful thing to do when you have a plan. And just building on what Lorna said, you don't have all the answers. You don't know how you're going to be fossil free as a whole economy, but you know that you have a lot of renewable electricity, and you know that part of the solution is going to be electrifying everything you can. So having that map, it's like, think about it like a navigation map, right? Like when you go on Google Maps and you say, I have to go from here to here. So having that vision is very important. Then, of course, it's about sectoral pathways. And in the case of road transportation, obviously the advice that we have to keep reinforcing is the importance of building those pathways with the private sector. Sweden, for example, has done a very important contribution by saying, this is the vision, and they actually went to the private sector. They are the one building the pathway, and then the private sector comes back to the government and says, here's how we're thinking about decarbonizing the entire sector. Not every country is doing it like that. My country didn't do it like that, and I would have liked more of that private sector input into the actual plan. Otherwise, it can end up being too desktop driven, right? Without the actual people working on the decarbonization. And then I would say, I wanted to add something that could be controversial in some countries, depending on where you are in manufacturing. But I actually want to mention it very happily in this context, given that this is a UK Global Compact space, and is the fact that the UK did something really interesting last week and very powerful by putting a calendar in a public way and saying, thank you so much, the internal combustion engine. Starting 2030, we're going to start shifting to a new era. And I think that even though some people would say, let's talk about incentives and opportunities and let's keep it positive. And I agree with that. It's about, you know, making sure people come on board in a very positive way. I would like to argue that at some point in this conversation, we will have to have those very clear deadlines from the government. And the cultural example I want to leave you with is one that we have seen in our society with the end of smoking in planes, right? At some point, society said, wait a second, why is it that we're smoking in planes? It's not a good idea. We have to at some point stop it, and it stopped, right? So my point with this is that part of the job of those policies is to incentivize and work with the private sector, and at some point say, but we're going to enter a new era and it starts here, and this is the time we'll give you to prepare. And I'll talk about cities later.
Lorna, I'm really interested to know what role, you know, regulation plays in your job, and whether it is helping you to decarbonize or whether it's actually constraining you, and any other role for government that you'd like to comment on.
No, that's fine. There's a few things I can probably comment on. So it was interesting to hear Monica say she might not be seen favorably by talking about that regulation and guideline. It's actually something I've said many, many years ago, actually, that one of the things you need for change is a target. And that target could be as much as we are stopping this. And because it gives everybody something to aim for, it gives them a known trajectory and how they get there. The difficulty we've had up till now is the target has been 2050. It's been a long way away. And you've had lots of local stuff leading into national stuff, leading into global stuff, and vice versa. And it's been very difficult for a fleet manager at that very operational level to say, I need to do this. And what a lot of people forget at that operational level, when you take an HGV vehicle, you take that generally for a minimum of 10 years. So if your natural life cycles, there is no way you are going to chuck that vehicle out after 5 just to meet some other kind of target. You're not going to want those stranded assets. So you have to have something that you can aim towards. And you do need a balance between the incentives to help you get there and get those early adopters to push that, test it, trial it. Same as you do with the new phones as they come out, you get those people that are very quick to take up that technology. And then you've got those that need to follow behind because they can't do anything else. But you all the way through it, it's consistently, here is a target that I have to get to. And if I can't get there, this is what I need to do to try and help me on that way as well. What that then does is it allows the private sectors, all the others, to determine how they get there. What we don't really want from any kind of government in this role is you must do it by this way. We just need to know that we've got to be clean by 2030, 2040, 2050, or whatever it is. So I think their role in this is very key in terms of that regulation and planning regime that allows us as industry users to then work out how we get there. We want to do this economically and efficiently and as fair as possible for everybody. So by having those hard targets, as painful as they may seem, it gives you something to work towards.
Thank you both. I think that's a key point about this deadline, even though 2030 is a ways away. Just as you noted, anybody that buys a new car is presumably calculating what they're going to get for it when they decide to sell it on again. And if they know that the market for petrol or diesel vehicles is going to be non-existent by the time they need to resell, they're probably not going to buy it in the first place. So setting that target at 2030 probably means sales of petrol and diesel vehicles is going to die much sooner than that. So really putting the pressure on, I think. So very encouraging news from our government. The next question I'd like to pose is, in your views, what are the greatest risks and opportunities in the next 3 to 5 years provided by the transition to electric transport?
I would think first in terms of cities, because I think because of COVID, many things are changing. We're still understanding how COVID is changing us. We know that one concrete impact has been our relationship with transportation in cities, right? There is a very, very active debate about the role of cars, the role of active mobility, and you know, we could have a whole discussion about just that. Point is that because of that conversation, I do believe that companies that are agile and understand that societal demand for better mobility, cleaner mobility, I think those companies are going to see a lot of benefits, because in the way I talk to about it, for example, with citizens and with people who are, you know, using the city, is around the concept of everyday life without an exhaust pipe. You know, that brings a lot of conversation about quality of life, about, you know, it doesn't have to be just climate, it doesn't have to be just emissions from a net zero perspective. It's about the kind of everyday life experience we're going to have. So my point is that companies that are able to go out there and say, hey, look at our fleets. They don't have exhaust pipes, they are silent, they are good for the city, they are good for the driver, they are saving us money, because that is the other point, right? It's not like you're doing this only because there is a climate imperative or a health imperative. It's also because, yes, they can be more expensive when you have to buy them up front, but the total cost of ownership is attractive in most cases. So there is, I would argue that logistics, you know, companies that have fleets are going to become much more interesting, much more, I mean, you can say cooler, you can say new voices in the debate, because before that, up until say 2 years ago, I found that the electric mobility discussion was going into places where it was not really productive, because you would want to talk about electrification, and then you would get all these discussions about, oh, but we need to use more bikes, and we need to use more buses, and we need to get into mass transit. And that's of course the case, but it was missing the voice that said, yes, we have to do that, and yet we have to electrify our fleets. And now we have all these really good stories coming from companies. So I would like to argue that those companies and people like Lorna have a very good role to play existing in the debate, you know, bringing bringing that voice and say, hey, look, we have something to tell you. We're doing this. It's good for the company, it's good for the city. And I would like to think, and I would be very curious to hear what Lorna thinks, but I would like to think that we, the ones who are connecting the dots, have to be very good at bringing the consumer on board, so that they actually reward the companies that are being the front runners. Do you see consumers supporting you, Lorna?
Yeah. Actually, I was going to go on to one of the risks and opportunities, you know, and it's an interesting question, because for me, a lot of them are exactly the same. So your risk and opportunity, the first one is supply chain. And Monica, you've already alluded to it, you know, demand is going to outstrip the current supply at the way it is at the moment. And we need to get manufacturers on board. And that's not just the vehicles, that's the infrastructure side of it as well. So demand is going to outstrip that. And I think for quite some time to go, we're going to keep going in this circle of we've got the infrastructure, but not everybody's using it yet. The vehicles then come in, then you've got more vehicles, then you've got infrastructure, and it's just going to keep going round and round until it balances itself out. So I think a lot of our risks and opportunities are the same when you come to discovering it. You've got the infrastructure piece itself and getting that delivered underlying. You know, we've got the government in the UK has offered that 1.3 billion, which is critical. And I think the opportunity there is the early deployment of that money, so that it gives that confidence back to the consumers again, that you're going to have fast charging networks on those motorways, that you're going to have that infrastructure in place that then debunks and gets rid of some of that anxiety that you've got as a user in how do I get from A to B and what happens if I run out of juice, you know. So it helps put that in place. And I think we've got that opportunity in terms of, and it's interesting because I always used to say as a fleet operator, The easiest thing you can do is buy a vehicle, and that's difficult enough as it is. So that's still true, but there is some low-hanging fruit out there. So I think the opportunity is get that confidence, as we alluded to earlier, and push that journey on. And again, Monica referenced it as a race. We've called it as kind of the pace of delivery, and you need to take that opportunity to get that side of it in. And then I think there's also risk and opportunities within technology. You know, we're constantly involved in it. So as an operator, the practical side of delivering, do I go down that EV route? Do I spend a fortune on that truck with that reduced payload that I've got, and I go electric and I do all that? Or do I hang on and wait a little bit because actually I want to go down a hydrogen route instead? Or do I put my money here? So again, it goes back to the earlier questions that we've had on the risk and opportunities. It's as a fleet operator, practically, where do I spend the limited money that I have? Where do I choose to take that risk and take that bold step and say, that's what I'm doing? And I think you'll find, and probably will come up as we go through this discussion, you know, what is the role of the alternatives in that, and how do we get there? But I think all of this comes together in terms of getting our future capacity right, understanding where we need to go, and just taking those low-hanging fruit opportunities that exist now. The risk is, I think, that demand piece as well.
Now, right at the start in her opening statement, Monica described this as low-hanging fruit. Do you feel like that within your company? And is that a shared perspective that does management at National Grid view decarbonizing the fleet as one of the easier tasks that they have to do as far as achieving net zero, or where do you feel you fit in the hierarchy there?
I think it all fits in together. It goes back to that consistency piece earlier as well. And where it fits together, of course, this isn't just transport that we're talking about. From National Grid, we're talking about the heating and decarbonisation of everything. And it's understanding right down at that consumer level, as the individual at home with my electric vehicle and my heating. And it's that symbiotic nature of those two together and how they fit in. So it isn't that anything is necessarily low-hanging fruit. It's probably low-hanging fruit in which is easiest to do, and we can do it. But it's all equal in terms of it works together, and it needs to work together.
Monica.
Yeah, and just to contextualize, I do believe that, of course, every task has complexity, and I think when it comes to logistics, it can get complicated in terms of governance because there are so many stakeholders engaged depending on the city. And imagine when you have a city that has a mayor and has a national government from another inclination. So, you know, coordination can be difficult. So we should not underestimate the complexity of that. That being said, I do think that it's very important when we have these problems that we get out of the mindset that is too complicated and we can't do it. Because I have been part of conversations that are almost irresponsible. You know, they amplify the complexity so much that at the end of 2 hours, it's all about staying the same way and not changing anything. And I think that is also a problem. So I do think that when people amplify the road transportation puzzle way too much because they don't have people like Lorna in the conversation, then it's easy to lose perspective. Because if you think, for example, about aviation or shipping, right now, if you want to go from London to New York, zero emissions, you really can't, right? You still have to go through that big breakthrough and invent it. Whereas on road transportation, at this point, yes, we know that at some point for the heavier trucks, there is a conversation going on, but for the vast majority of everyday transactions and logistics in a city, there is a lot that we can do already. So my point with the fact that it's not easy, but it's easier than others, is that I think we really have to liberate ourselves from that, because from that kind of over complication that I hear in some places. Because when I have heard those conversations, what I notice is that usually is not people working inside companies. So when you hear somebody like Lorna, when they say, you know, here's the bottleneck, here's where we're struggling, is very concrete, and is about, and usually the person working with that particular fleet knows exactly the ask. They would go, you know, they would go to a manufacturer and say, here's my ask, or to a mayor or to a policymaker. So I hope that next year that's the kind of conversations we're going to have, you know, the very concrete things that we need to do in order to go faster. Yeah. And one more point I wanted to make about the challenges. I do think that one of the positive dynamics I have observed with the Transportation Decarbonization Alliance is this tendency to say, okay, you have this problem, you have this problem, you're facing this issue in this city. Let's do the following, right? And then coming together with people who are, you know, who are in that kind of mental map, I find it very powerful. You know, the power of collaboration in this particular sector is there. So there again, you know, for people who are getting started, don't underestimate the power of joining coalitions that are working really hard on solving this on a very pragmatic level. Is there, they are there to help. And after the call, you know, if one of you who's listening wants to join that kind of collective effort, is easy. That's something we can solve with an email.
Now, I just want to follow on from that. I get a question for Lorna, because I think I'm really curious whether that advocacy piece is part of your job description, and do you have time? Do you have a mandate to go and engage mayors and to say, you know, this is the ask, as Monica said, because, you know, clearly you're nodding, you know what you need, but do you have the means to get that request through, or is this something that within the company there's a mechanism for communicating that? How does that work in practice?
So yes, and you've probably noticed by nature of me, I'm going to do that anyway. But you can, and actually within the fleet industry, Monica's touched on a few bits already. There are lots of associations out there that help you do this. There are lots of people you can go to and talk to and help get that. So a couple of years ago, I was heavily involved in going to all the local cities and sitting in on the round table discussions to help with the clean air zone plans. And again, it was given that, it was whilst I was at Royal Mail, and it was given that, again, that lens of, but this is the operator, this is the challenge we're having, have you thought about this, and actually, can I help you do this by doing this? And it was having those very sensible conversations early enough in the process that mean a boundary got redrawn or something else happened that allowed the flow. Payment systems were then discussed through the JACU route on that government level, on how do you get that national and local disparity to be more cohesive, that enables your operators, especially your national operators that are going from place to place and moving all over, and going internationally. How do you get that consistency in there? So in terms of advocacy, yes, and I think you can do it, and the doors are far more open than you realise. Everybody's actually willing to help each other here, and you can knock on quite a lot of doors and people will talk to you, and vice versa. And I think, going back to the early question of what do we see our role in business, that's key at the moment. We need to keep those dialogues going, and we need to do it in a very pragmatic way as well.
Yes, Monica.
I'd like to add something, because it's important to also look at what's going on in other geographies. And I find that this year has been very, very productive in terms of these alliances that Lorna is referring to, and that I have seen working in other spaces and working really well. One example is what happened in California this year with, you know, California has set the world's first rule for zero emission trucks, which is a very important development, given that diesel truck pollution is hurting a lot of people, especially in certain low-income communities. And there is research that shows, actually maps where these communities are. And what is very interesting about how that rule happened and why it was so ambitious, it was because of the role of private sector people in a coalition, right? So it's very important to look for those examples of, you know, several pieces of the ecosystem, as I call it, coming together. You know, people with charging infrastructure backgrounds, people from renewables, people that care about environmental justice. You know, so in the case of California, it led to a very virtuous circle because the regulator had a certain level of ambition to begin with. And through that coalition, everybody understood that if they increased the level of ambition, that would be good for California, because then they could argue that they could develop a hub for zero emission trucking. So it wasn't just the emissions, it was also the idea that manufacturing could bring opportunities. And the other example is more recent, is something called ZETA, Z-E-T-A, and is this Zero Emission Transportation Association that was born in the US officially like last week. And it's a mix of companies that produce zero emission vehicles, companies that have charging operations, and others. And they came together in Washington. And now when you go to the website, it officially says our goal is to move to zero emission vehicles, cars, vans, buses, trucks by 2030. And it's coming from business. So my point is, it's not just the NGOs. And I think that is a twist that has become very important in this story.
Okay, I'm gonna now shift things a little bit more technical, but also I have the list of questions in the box is getting too long to fit on my screen. And then I see an opportunity here to knock off one that we had already received. So I'm gonna do a bit of a combination here. And so in part, it's the question, what do you think are the most promising solutions for long distance transport? Because we also had a question earlier about the role of biofuels, which I think rolls into that. And we have a question here just in terms of your views on alternative sources. And now I'm saying alternative to electrification, which has sort of been our focus so far. And Lorna, you did mention the choices that had to be made, and I think there's some source of stress there, and I think that links into one of our other questions about stepping into the darkness. And so, what are your views on hydrogen, biofuels, green gas, and electric vehicles for long distance haulage?
Where do I start on that one? Because the answer isn't necessarily right for everybody. And I think that's one of the key things to make, actually. The answers are going to be different for everybody. And it depends, again, to one of my early comments on uses cases. So all of those fuels you mentioned play a part, just as FEVs play a part in the electric role as well. So some of these, I think, are going to be longer term, much more sustainable, especially if you talk the hydrogen route. You know, you're looking at how you can do this. I know you missed one, actually. They're even talking about containeries and, you know, having different solutions in different cities around the world as well. So I think what you've got here are stages. And if you think where some of those alternative fuels are on that logistics journey, they're probably about 10 years behind where we were on the EV journey to start with. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn going forward. So if you take, we start at the earliest one that most people have adopted. If you take the CNG to start with, you know, it's how you get that into your vehicles. Can your motive units be converted with what you're pulling as well? Can you get it on the right type of things? But the CNG is then, it's how you manage the transitions from one fuel type to the other. So you can take a stepping stone from CNG into biomethane, and you can take a stepping stone from there into hydrogen. So it's understanding on those journeys, and any company at any point can say, do you know what, I'm going to leapfrog that one, and I'm going to go and try and take the next stage on that journey as well. So I think in terms of the future logistics stuff, there are some EVs out there. Will those be sustainable with the challenges we have on payload? Or are you actually looking at some of these gas solutions and different fuel types in order to get you on that journey and at least start that road and start taking away some of those perceived barriers that are there and get over those user cases so that you can then take that journey forward into the next one. I think I've answered that for you.
Yeah, I think it's also very important to keep in mind that when you look at where we need to go in 2050 as a well, hopefully before, but let's just say 2050, we really have to by then be pretty much a society that is running on renewables. So I think that where the conversation has to be very lucid and very calm, because it can get to you know, very heated arguments, is around the fact that we really have to the extent we can, talk about green hydrogen in most countries. I know that in some countries where you have gas, it's difficult. You know, let's not just pretend it's not difficult, but it's fossil fuels and we cannot not say that. So my concern sometimes when I hear about hydrogen and it's not clear where the case is made, it's confusing, because before you know it is the hydrogen economy, and then the next paragraph is, well, let's just make sure it's hydrogen-based transportation, and before we know it, is trashing on EVs, and before we know it, it takes a long time to charge. So the last thing we need is to, right now, in these five critical years for electrification of transportation, the last thing we need is to have voices out there trashing EVs because they want their turn in 10 years, you know? So we need to be very good at keeping in mind that we need to switch to renewables, and that if we're going to talk about green hydrogen, is very legitimate to say, excuse me, are we talking about green hydrogen or fossil hydrogen? Because if you are in a space where asking that question is uncomfortable, then we need to have that conversation. So I just wanted to flag that, because I know that it's a tension out there that we need to have space to discuss.
Well, we have a persistent question coming up in the chat that I think links into this regarding sequestration of carbon, and it would seem to me that that specifically relates to the hydrogen question, and presumably that CCS technology would need to be developed in harmony with any move towards a hydrogen economy before that was even close to being something we could talk about being net zero. Is that?
Yes, for blue hydrogen, as they call it. But I find that it's very important to, you know, with the blue, it's always confusing. You know, some people just say clean hydrogen is blue hydrogen, but then it makes a lot of assumptions about the cost of CCS. So my point is that let's have that conversation and look for opportunities for, especially for the companies that are very serious about their trucks and they really want to get the right solution. And at the same time, my plea would be to not dismiss the electrification of trucks because of some narrative that is saying, oh, it's definitely long track, is definitely hydrogen. I mean, we had a panel on the 11th of November on Transportation Day as part of the Race to Zero dialogues. And if you ask a company like Scania, they will tell you that, you know, as far as they are concerned, they are still working on you know, battery electric trucks. So my point is, it has to be a very sober conversation. That's my point.
And I'll come in on two areas there. So I'm going to put my national grid hat on and talk about, you know, we do look at these future energy scenarios. We work, our energy electricity system operator looks at that and how we're going to take that, you know, right through to shipping perhaps being ammonia, to aviation relying on synthetic jet fuels. We're looking at all sorts of options. We're working in partnership with industries on the carbon capture and storage technologies. So as Monica says, it's looking at all those opportunities and taking them. And if I bring that right down to a macro level, we do that in fleets every day. We look at right vehicle, right job, and it's going to be right fuel type, right job. And it's taken that all the way through. And taking that hat off and put my little fleet operator hat back on. I'm just going to make a couple of points to anybody out in the audience who is like me. And until only a few months ago, I didn't have a clue what the difference between green, blue, brown, grey and black was. And I'm having to do a big education piece. And it was something I did on the circuit a while back, doing electric vehicles. You know, a fleet manager has a brand new lexicon that they've got to get used to. They've had to get used to the entire 3.6, 7.6, single phase, 3-phase, and they're working their way through that language. Now they're into gas, and now they're into multiple colors on a hydrogen solution. You know, there is a brand new world out there that everybody's having to get used to on this journey. So it's not one of the questions, but one of the things I think we need to be very clear about is education and bringing people on the journey with us. It's that level of understanding that is absolutely critical, that people understand the differences. There's a lot of myths out there, and that's just because people really don't understand it.
Okay, I want to knock off that first question on the list. And I think, Lorna, you have already touched on this, that stepping into the darkness, that idea of having a target, but not knowing how you're going to get there. And you mentioned that, but I think maybe could we go a little bit more granular? How do you get, you've got to convince senior management to take that jump with you. How do you make the case that you don't have a solution now, but you know you're going to have one before, you know, in time to achieve this target? Where does that confidence come from, and how do you get others to believe you?
So I think I could probably tackle this and one of the other questions that I think I saw in there, which talks about the low-hanging fruit again. It depends on your fleet and the makeup of your fleet, and it depends on the type of business you are. But some of the very simple stuff you can do. So when we talk low-hanging fruit and you use history into how you get those targets and get that confidence going forward. So history at the moment has taught us that cars are actually some of your low-hanging fruit at the moment. And it is amazing how the government incentive on BIK this year has just removed the majority of those perceived barriers overnight, because it's down to that fiscal side. So it's balancing that cost off. So what you can use in that when you're putting your business cases through, when you're trying to talk to your management, is you look at the future of legislation and where it's going, and you map that side of it out. You balance your costs. When I say you balance your costs, what you do there, especially with that low-hanging fruit pieces, you show people you can make that journey on the cars that are the easier route to do right now, because you've got the government incentives there. You can take advantage of those. They are designed for you to take advantage of those. The home place charging grants that you've got, the workplace charging grants that you can get. So you put that into your business case and you take those first steps. You've basically proved you can do that. From there, you talk about, and you use that history of it. It might have taken you a few years to get there. That's why I know it's going to take me a few years to get to the next bit, but I can make that journey and switch, because we've seen how long it's taken some of the manufacturers to bring their cars out. Those cars are flooding the marketplace now. She says COVID kind of delayed some of that, but those cars are coming in. And that technology is moving into the vans, and from the vans, it's moving up through the sizes. So you can use all those as the lessons in taking that step-by-step journey into how you're going to get there, and have that confidence. A solution will pop up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I could also add something that has been very present in many conversations, and it's not necessarily conversations in the UK, but because I come from Costa Rica, and it's, you know, it's an emerging economy, and I used to do work in Colombia and in Chile. There was also this idea that, you know, you would bring a story and then they would say, oh yeah, but you know, Lorna is from the UK, you know, it's very easy for her to say it because she's in the UK. You would argue, well, it's not easy, you know, she does have to do a lot of work. So I always, whenever I hear, oh, but that's Europe, I always say, it's even difficult there, you know, come on, to give them.
I have that conversation with my US colleagues all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So first point to my Latin American colleagues, give them some credit in Europe and the UK, whatever, you know, it's difficult. It's a big victory. But the other point is that you know, that could be a lazy argument when you're having these conversations, because it's very easy to say, oh, but that's Europe, you know, I don't have to do it. And what I have seen both in Colombia and Chile and Costa Rica is that once you go more granular, once you start understanding the technology and you have an Excel file and you start plugging the numbers, there is a magical moment where some operator will say, wait a second, is this correct? You know, when they start looking at the operational side, because there is this perception that it's just too expensive, we can't afford it, we're an emerging economy, this is a luxury we cannot do. And what you have seen in both in Chile and Colombia, in one case with a fleet of buses, and in the case of Colombia with a fleet of medium-sized trucks, is that it was very good business, for example, for the financial, in this case, a financial player that realized they could buy the fleets and then lease them. So my point is that it's very important to do numbers in order to shake a lot of the hesitation that you will see when the first round of targets is proposed by a brave person inside a company. So that has worked even in emerging markets. So yeah, it's a good story.
And on that point of it not being easy, it took me 3 months to put my first model together on getting those numbers right.
We are out of time, and that's really too bad. I wish we had another hour. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Apologies, audience, that we couldn't get through all of your questions. This is obviously a huge topic, and I think perhaps we'll invite you back again at some point in the new year to catch up and get into some of these issues that we didn't have time for today. So Monica, Lorna, again, huge thank you. It's really appreciated that you gave us your time today and that you were so candid and forthright with sharing your insights. Rob, could we get that last slide up now? I'm just going to tell everyone a little bit about the events we still have to come in our climate forum. So the government and business dialogue was this morning, and we will have a recording of that up as soon as we can. It was a fantastic discussion. We had Kwasi Kwarteng, the Minister of State from BEIS, as well as Joachim Reiter from Vodafone. We spoke about ambition loops and science-based targets and net zero, and the role of business and government in bringing that about. This has been fantastic. Next up, in only half an hour, we're going to be speaking with Rachel McEwen from SSE and Sue Ferns from Prospect about the just transition, two organizations that have done a tremendous amount of work in how, and it's one of the questions I regret that we didn't get to today, was how do we balance this whole net zero agenda into the wider social responsibility agenda. And so we're gonna do a deep dive into that in half an hour. Tomorrow, we're looking at reducing Scope 3 emissions. It's probably the biggest barrier for most companies in setting a science-based target or a net zero target. So we've got Jonathan Dunn from Anglo American, and he's going to speak about reducing Scope 3 emissions in the use of sold products, a very specific aspect of that very big challenge. Tomorrow at 1:30, Making My Money Matter is a campaign being led by Richard Curtis and his Project Everyone team. We've got Richard, Tony Burden, and Emma Douglas from Legal in General going to speak about how we can decarbonize pension funds, which is a really important area. And finally, the final event in our forum is a debate on carbon offsets. And we've got two fantastic teams that will be going head to head in a proper debate about this really critical and challenging aspect of net zero. What is an appropriate role for carbon offsetting in net zero targets? I hope that you'll be able to join us for some of these other sessions. Again, thank you very much to our audience for joining us. Thank you, Lorna and Monica. It's been a pleasure. And we look forward to working with you all again in the future. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.